let's give it another minute or two. All right, well, let's start up then. First, I would like to, my name's Don Belmont. I'm the chair of the Tikkun Olam volunteers at Temple Shalom, and I want to welcome everybody to this webinar. We're very excited to have Nick Penniman join us as the speaker today. Rabbi Miller is under the weather, and so I'll be hosting the program today. You know, I think I had a wake-up moment during the about 4 years ago when Kellyanne Conway said her comment about alternative facts, and that was a new concept for me at that time. And since I've learned, you know, read and try to deal with that idea of alternative facts and what that means and how people can have different realities of things that we all consider to be the truths that we live with. Our speaker today, Nick Penniman, has made those sorts of issues his life work, and that's why I'm so very excited for him to be speaking with us today. This is a webinar format, so what we'll do is after introduction, Mr. Penniman will speak, and if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please submit them in writing in chat or in Q&A, and then we'll moderate that at the end of his presentation. Nick Penniman is currently the co-founder and CEO of Issue One, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to strengthen American democracy and government ethics. It's supported by people on the left, it's supported by people on the right, and perhaps he'll spend a little bit of time and tell us about his organization as well. In 2016, he co-authored a book called Nation on the Take: How Big Money Corrupts Our Democracy and What We Can Do About It. And it talks about the influence of money and other influences on public policy and on American democracy. His background goes way deeper than that. Mr. Penniman told me that he started as a journalist is his background. He's not a politician by background. And his writing and his life work reflects that passion for getting down to what truths are. And I welcome him, and I'm so glad that he is joining our Temple Shalom webinar today. So Nick, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Don. When the folks asked me to do this, we debated whether or not I should narrow it down to a single topic or whether or not I should talk about the various threats that our democracy is facing today. And in the end, it seems like people settled on the notion that I should talk about the multiple threats to our democracy instead of just focusing on one. But we certainly, during the Q&A, can focus on just one or on specific questions when you want. I did found Issue One 8 years ago. We are a bipartisan nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. We've got a budget of about 6 million. Sometimes it balloons up significantly. We raised almost $30 million in 2020 because that was a big election year and we were doing a lot to try to protect the elections from attack. But otherwise, our main goal is to produce federal legislation and get it passed to fix various things that are wrong with our democracy. We've recruited 200 former members of Congress to join us in this effort. We call them the Reformers Caucus. It's kind of a play on words, former members, Reformers Caucus. And of those 200 former House members and senators, 85 are Republican and the rest are Democrats. So everything we do it in a nonpartisan or bipartisan way. And we do that mainly out of the philosophy that democracy should not be a partisan issue, that there are plenty of things that will forever be partisan, but when it comes to our democracy, it's something we all need to do together. We can fight about taxes and the size of government and gun control and abortion and everything else, but let's make sure that the field upon which we're doing battle is secure, and that is our democracy. So with that, let's see if I can click on here. I think the most important thing to remember right now, especially given the situation in Ukraine, is that democracy is not the default. As Stein Ringen of Oxford University says, it's a form of government that has to be created with determination, and it will disintegrate unless it's nurtured. I think that this is kind of common sense for almost anyone. You know, a corporation disintegrates unless it's nurtured and renewed. A garden disintegrates unless it is constantly nurtured and renewed. But I'm not entirely sure that this is a thought that runs through the heads of a lot of Americans. I think in many ways we've taken our democracy for granted, certainly in the last 30 years or so, and a lot has deteriorated since then. And so we're at this point in which we need to kind of reapply ourselves collectively to the project of democracy. It's not, of course, just Ukraine that's under attack when it comes to democracy. Democracy has been sinking and receding all over the world for more than a decade. As you guys know, the situation in Hungary and Poland and Thailand and Kenya and South America, many of these places, it just doesn't look good. And so for 16 years straight, according to Freedom House, which was founded after World War II to track the rise and fall of democracies, for 16 years now, more countries have slid away from democracy than have moved towards it. So we're obviously facing an historic standoff in the war between democracy and authoritarianism. And of course, as America's light flickers, so does the project of democracy flicker and sometimes fade around the world. Also, just want to remind everyone that more than half of the people on Earth do not live in democracies. Democracy is actually still a very precious thing. You won't be able to see the fine print on this probably, but dark green is full democracy, you know, lighter green is kind of partial democracy. And then obviously once you get down to red, you're dealing with not just deep red, not just authoritarian, but basically almost totalitarian situations. You know, this is something we need to just be aware of, because I think especially for my generation, having grown up in the 1980s and 90s, at the end of the Cold War, you know, after the Berlin Wall had come down, again, we kind of took democracy for granted and felt like it's just the way of humankind. Well, it's actually not the way of humankind. The way of humankind, if you look at the last 10,000 years of human history, leans much more towards kings and rulers and authoritarians than it does towards self-government and consensus. So this is a very precious experiment that we're engaged in, not just now, but in the last 250 years, and we've got to fight to make it right and constantly renew it. In terms of the struggles that our democracy is facing right now, I'm sure you guys have your own list, but I break it down into 4 categories. Number 1, the massive influence of money on politics and policymaking. Number 2, gerrymandering. Number 3, the increased risk to our elections and to the protection of free and fair elections. And then finally, disinformation and the fragmentation of the media environment so that we're not really having a single conversation anymore as a country. So let's start with money in politics. The most obvious point is there's just too much of it. The 2020 cycle was a $14 billion cycle, and most of that money was raised by politicians in Congress who have to raise it in $2,700 increments, because that was the campaign contribution limit then. It's now $2,900 because it's indexed. But that's a whole lot of fundraising that these folks have to do to be able to get the billions of dollars that is required to run the elections. Now, super PACs are a part of that, certainly, and organizations called 501c4 organizations, but still the bulk of that money is being raised in roughly $3,000 increments, phone call by our members of Congress. This is in stark contrast, by the way, to the 2000 election cycle, which in aggregate was about a $5 billion cycle. So just think of that, 5 presidential election cycles went from 5 billion to almost 15 billion. In terms of the time they spend raising money, I thought David Jolly, this Republican from Florida, former Republican, said it best. Quote, "It's the #1 job of any member of Congress to raise money. Any member of Congress who says otherwise is lying. It's plain and simple." Jolly and so many of the 200 former members of Congress that I've recruited to my organization have said that they typically spent somewhere between 2 and 5 hours a day just raising money. 2 and 5 hours a day. The folks who are doing 5 hours are the ones who are in the competitive races, and they are scared to death that if they don't raise enough, they'll lose. If you just look at the Ralph Warnock race in Georgia in 2020, that Warnock race was an $800 million Senate race, just that one race alone. And obviously a lot of that was outside money, but still Warnock and his competitors were having to raise a ton of money. So, what does that do to them? Well, number one, it puts them, they can't raise money from Capitol Hill because it's against House and Senate rules. So what they have to do is walk or take a cab over to the DNC or RNC headquarters, which are these kind of soulless corporate buildings in Washington where they sit in cubicles with headsets on, or sometimes just cell phones. And they've got call sheets, stacks of call sheets. And for 2 to 5 hours a day, they're dialing for dollars. They're just calling people. Now, of course, most of these people are people who do not live in their district. They're rich people who live in the top 10 major cities in America. And of course, almost all of the people they're calling are highly ideological. So it's very rare that, a member of Congress is going to hear from a donor, "Hey, sure, I'll re-up at $3,000, but I want you to go back to Washington and make some meaningful compromises," right? Instead, they're hearing, "Of course I'll re-up, go give them hell." And so, they're kind of, basting themselves, marinating themselves all day long, not just in the lives of the richest Americans, but also in those who are most ideologically partisan. The other way that they raise money, of course, is directly from the interests that are lobbying their congressional committees based on assignments. So if you look at the money that went to the House Financial Services Committee, which is what this is, the top 3 contributors to the House Financial Services Committees are folks who represent securities and investment. Number 1, $10 million just in the mid-year cycle went to them. Number 2, insurance companies, which of course is also finance at $8 million. And number 3, real estate, which is basically finance too, mortgages and whatnot, banks, $7 million. So what that looks like in Washington here, and I'm down at 14th and K Street right now, so in downtown Washington, is there are about 20 restaurants in DC that are notorious for holding fundraisers for members of Congress. So right now at probably all of those restaurants, because it's 1:45 or maybe it just ended, members of Congress are sitting in private rooms at these restaurants, and they're surrounded by lobbyists who are lobbying their committees. And at the end of that event, the lobbyists will literally hand checks to someone in the corner of the room who works on the member's campaign. Those checks will be put in an envelope and then cashed into the bank. If this isn't a conflict of interest in almost any other industry in America, this would be seen as such a profound conflict of interest that those members wouldn't even be able to enter that room. But instead, they have to do it day after day after day and collect the money from the very interests that they're supposed to be regulating on our behalf. Dark money is a problem, of course. It continues to rise. This is just who the top dark money contributors are. So a lot of people say, well, if it's dark money, how do you know what they contributed, right? Well, we did a report. It took us 6 months just to dig up all the paperwork that's filed around 501c4 organizations to try to figure it out. And this is the result of our report. So Chamber of Commerce was number one at 130 million, Crossroads GPS, that's a conservative political group at 110 million, Americans for Prosperity, that's run by Grover Norquist, he's a conservative activist, 59 million, National Rifle Association, 58 million, and it goes on. So these are groups that are not required to disclose where their donors come from or where they're spending their money. And as I said, it can be done, but it takes months and months just to figure it out. This is the largest trend in political giving right now, or political money right now, is dark money. Just so that I don't leave you with the notion that this is all a fait accompli, and getting back to the notion of we need to be fixing our democracy right now, there are fixes for all these things. Bipartisan bills exist to revitalize the Federal Election Commission, to create public financing for candidates. And I'd love to talk with you all about that, because some people say, oh, I don't want to be funding the campaign of someone I disagree with. Well, you do it every day. You are currently funding Marjorie Taylor Greene. You're funding her salary, you're funding her staff, you're funding her offices, or you're funding a Democrat, name whatever Democrat you don't like, you're funding them. You're funding them to tweet, you're funding them to go on cable news and spout off and destroy the other side. You're funding them right now. So maybe we should take the political funding away and just say that they're basically public property while they're public servants, and we should be funding their campaigns and get them off the fundraising treadmills. We got to eliminate dark money. There are multiple bills to do that, one of which we actually wrote. And there's so much more that can be done. So we can get into that soon. The one that has not been written yet, which we're working on, is a bill that would bar what I call transactional giving, which is that the money that goes directly from those lobbyists to the members of Congress. Okay, number 2, gerrymandering. So this is, I feel like this is almost the most self-explanatory one of all. You can talk to an 8-year-old about this, and he or she would naturally get it. Here's just a great example of a heavily gerrymandered state. This is North Carolina. So you can see that Republicans got 50% of US House votes statewide in the 2018 midterms. And yet they won, I'm looking at the 2 things down below, yet they won 10 of 13 congressional seats. So let me just repeat that. 50% of voters in the state of North Carolina voted Democratic in the statewide elections, but because of gerrymandering, Democrats only won 3 out of the 13 seats. That is extreme gerrymandering. And it goes on all over the place, all the time. You know, it's going on in Alabama right now. 30% of the population is Black in Alabama, yet only 1 of 7 districts are Black majority districts. So there's a racial component, of course, oftentimes. This is the state of Maryland, my home state. This is Congressman Sarbanes' district. He's a Democrat. Not only is he a Democrat, but he also sponsored the biggest democracy reform bill to be put before Congress this year. Believe it or not, this is his congressional district. I mean, as you know, that you've got to always have some contiguous nature with these districts. You can't just completely leapfrog. So there's got to be a tiny, literally sometimes it's a street or a corridor of a couple streets that connects them. But you can see that the trouble they went to, so to speak, to try to connect all these districts to make Sarbanes' district out of it. The Democrats, for what it's worth, in the state legislature, which dominates the state legislature here in Maryland, tried to gerrymander out the final remaining Republican district in Maryland this year, and the court had to step in and block them from doing so. This is a state, my state, where we have a Republican governor, Larry Hogan. So statewide, you've got a Republican governor, but only 1 Republican House seat, and Democrats tried to get rid of even that House seat. So both sides do it. Here's the big result of it. Right now, this is the Cook Political Report, which is kind of the Bible of politics. The gray thing is, with the little gray box there, is what you should be paying attention to. According to the Cook Political Report, there are 15 toss-up seats this year. Out of 435 House seats, 15 are actually competitive. The rest of them are basically locked down. The 132 and 143 are completely locked down. Forget it. You know, the kind of lighter blue, lighter reds are maybe competitive, but only 15 are truly competitive. So what happens when you've got only 15 competitive House seats and the other 420 members of Congress, all they have got to do really is get through their primary? Well, what happens, of course, is that their sole job in life is to appeal to their base. And they're typically 10 to 20% of Americans turn out for primary elections. So they're appealing to that 10 or 20% on each side of the aisle that's the most radical and the most driven. So when we talk about polarization in America, when we talk about why we can't get things done and people can't come together as we normal Americans do every day, this is a huge reason why, and we've got to solve it. There are fixes, of course. You can do this with federal legislation. Number one, let me point that out, because a lot of people will say, well, don't you just have to leave it up to the states to pass anti-gerrymandering measures? And the answer is absolutely not. So Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution is one sentence. And that one sentence in the Constitution says, the state legislatures shall determine the means by which members of Congress are elected, semicolon, unless Congress does. So within the second clause of that sentence in Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, it basically says Congress has the ability to establish its own rules when it thinks necessary. That's why we have a Federal Election Commission. It's why we have the Voting Rights Act. It's why we have why we have an Election Assistance Commission. We've got a lot of things in place that Congress has put in place that have established federal precedents for things like campaign finance laws, for voting rights. So we could actually pass, and by the way, there is a bipartisan bill that's been in Congress for more than 20 years. It's introduced and reintroduced every 2 years. Bipartisan legislation that would establish uniform redistricting commissions throughout the country, nonpartisan commissions, and with one fell swoop, we could get rid of gerrymandering. Now, we still self-sort as a society. Democrats move to places where Democrats are and Republicans move to places where Republicans are. So it's not that all of a sudden we're going to have 435 competitive House races. But the experts who have looked at this say that we could at least end up with 30 to 40% of those races being competitive, as opposed to, 15 races, which is what, less than 5%. So that's number one. We can do it through federal legislation. There is bipartisan legislation. Number two, court challenges. That's basically the way it gets played out these days. As I said, the court in Maryland had to step in and block the Democratic legislature's attempt to get rid of that one Republican seat. But even that is always going to be reactionary. It's going to be in reaction to a really radical plan by one party. But what the court can't do is come in and say, oh, we're going to redraw these districts because we just think they're wrong. The only thing they can do is if someone introduces a plan that just is completely nuts, the courts can say, no, that crazy plan can't go through, but they can't redraw every district. They don't have the ability to do that, nor do we want them doing that. And then finally, you can do it at the state level, but that's a very, very slow process. And of course, the most gerrymandered states are the ones where you're least likely to be able to get it done. So next threat, number 3, election protection. This is not something, when I founded the organization 8 years ago, that I ever expected to have to really spend a lot of time on. Of all the aspects of our democracy, from money in politics to gerrymandering to congressional reform to disinformation to civic, all the stuff that's out there, our elections and the people trusting the vote and believing in the vote and not messing with the vote was something that I think we all felt like we could kind of, rightly so, just not worry about. That is all changed very quickly. And there have been attacks at the state level on election law. The most disturbing of those attacks are ones that place election administration under greater partisan control, which has now occurred in 8 states throughout the country. we can have arguments about some of the voting bills that have gone through in many of the Republican states and whether or not those voting reforms were necessary or unnecessary, whether they're racist or not racist. But the one that worries us most here at issue 1 is the ones that place it under greater partisan control. Unfortunately, all of those bills have gone through in Republican states and have been pushed by Republican state legislatures. It's part of what Steve Bannon calls his precinct by precinct plan, which has a couple aspects to it. So number 1 is to, again, gain greater partisan control through laws of the vote. Number 2, install people who are sympathetic with the MAGA movement into positions of power. Right now, two-thirds of the Secretary of State races in America have MAGA candidates running for them. And in some of those cases, you've got candidates who have said that they would have decertified the 2020 election. And they actively spread lies about elections. They're now running for secretaries of state. So that's part 2 of the Bannon plan. And then part 3 of the Bannon plan is to, in 2024, is to basically, if the votes in the swing states don't go the way of Trump, to pull the levers and to try to create enough chaos and confusion that the determination of the Electoral College can be thrown to the state legislatures. In each one of the swing states, except for Minnesota, Republicans control both houses in the state legislatures. So that's the final kind of piece of the plan. And he's been explicit about this, by the way. There's nothing, I'm not making this up. He's got a daily podcast called The War Room. And they, on a daily basis, he keeps track of where his plan is and how it's coming together. Here's the other kind of striking thing that's going on. This is, it's almost makes more sense to work backwards from this, starting at the bottom with the bottom number at 40%. So this is a recent CNN poll. In January 2021, so January 6th, the day of the attack on the Capitol, 40% of Americans said that they couldn't trust the results of American elections. By September of last year, that number had gone up to 52%. And by January of this year, that number had gone up to 56%. So it's perhaps the first time that, at least that any pollster knows, in American history, in which more than half the population says that they can't trust the results of our elections. Of all of the existential threats to democracy, this is probably the greatest, because democracy doesn't work if people think that the governments that have been installed are illegitimate or got there through fraud. Democracy completely breaks down in that situation. And so what we're seeing is that increasingly we're entering that zone. As I said, there are extremists who are trying to take over election administration. The guy on the left with the cowboy hat is Mark Fincham. He's Donald Trump's handpicked candidate to become Secretary of State of Arizona. Fincham is the one who said that he not only would have decertified the election in 2020, but that he would do it again. And on a daily basis, if you look at his Twitter feed, he spreads absolute, complete, verifiable lies about the election. He now wants to be Secretary of State, and he has a really good shot at it. The guy on the right is Jody Hice, also a Trump-picked candidate for Secretary of State in Georgia. You all remember Brad Raffensperger, the very conservative Republican in Georgia who stood up and did the right thing. And when Trump asked him to find votes in Georgia, he said no. Jody Hice is currently polling almost 20 points above Brad Raffensperger in Georgia. So unless something extraordinary happens soon, it's likely that Hice will be the next Secretary of State of Georgia. Hice has also said that he would have decertified the 2020 election. And he's a big spreader of disinformation about elections. So this is part of the Bannon plan. It's happening. We just need to, you all should realize it. It's not just happening at the Secretary of State level, it's also happening at the precinct level. So for instance, in Wayne County, Michigan, you guys might remember during 2020, there's a certification process in Michigan that begins with the Board of Canvassers. And then eventually each county Board of Canvassers certifies each county vote. That then goes up to the statewide Board of Canvassers, and then they certify. That certification process is important. And you'll probably remember that Donald Trump was calling Wayne County Board of Canvasser members to try to get them to fail to certify, because he knew that he could create a cascade effect that could perhaps decertify the Michigan vote. So right now there is someone on the Wayne County, just recently appointed to the Wayne County Board of Canvassers, who said that he never would have certified the vote, that the Democrats stole the entire election. And so he's in place there. They've got one in place in Macomb County, Michigan, and in many other counties throughout the country. There's the Wayne County right there. The other kind of remarkable thing that's happening is that, of course, that anyone or, in elected office who is unwilling to go along with the narrative that the last election was full of fraud and stolen is excommunicated from the Republican Party. The most obvious one of these is Liz Cheney. She is as conservative gets on almost every single issue. I can't think of, other than Tom Cotton and maybe a handful of others, ones who are more conservative than her. But nonetheless, and of course, her family has played a massive role in building the Republican Party. But she was recently voted out of the Republican Party by the GOP in the state of Wyoming. They passed a resolution back in November that said that she is officially no longer a member of the Republican Party in her state. The other thing that's worth noting is that in terms of this plan to kind of decertify or undermine the next election, that those who are working on it are raising money like crazy right now. They've got their own fundraising operations because it's so hard to figure out what they're doing with the money. We don't even know if they're applying the money to the very cause that they claim. They could just be pocketing the money and doing other stuff with it, but they're certainly raising a good deal of it. So we talked about the voting restrictions. We can talk more about that. If this happens, if the Bannon plan comes together and at some point some state legislature in a swing state decides that they're going to assign a slate of electors to the Electoral College that is inconsistent with the popular vote in that state, we end up with a full-blown constitutional crisis, the level of which we have not seen since the Civil War. And I just want to point out, this is not theoretical. This is a plan that is taking place. It is happening as we speak. And if it comes together, fully comes together and happens, I don't know how we get out of it as a country. The best piece, if you want to read about it, is this one right here that by Robert Kagan, who is a conservative journalist, used to be a member of served in the Reagan administration, is close with the Bush family, who wrote Our Constitutional Crisis is Already Here when he dug deep into this Bannon plan. There are fixes to this too. We need to amend the Electoral Count Act. That's the law that governs how Congress interfaces with the Electoral College and how the Electoral College works. There are some smart things that we can amend into the Electoral Count Act to try to batten down the hatches and just make it a more secure and reliable process. My organization is leading on that right now in Washington, with working with a number of Democratic and Republican senators to get the language right and to try to get it done before the August recess occurs here in DC. We've got to get more funding out to the states, and we've got to incentivize more best practices. That's one thing that can help instill greater confidence in our elections and give election administrators the ability to more swiftly do the vote counting and provide a better experience for voters. People can volunteer to become poll workers. This is really important. Part of the Bannon plan is to deploy people all over the country to basically try to become poll watchers. And I could go deep into this if you want me to, but I'll just give you an example of what some of those poll watchers did in 2020. So in 2020 in Georgia, they were counting the votes, and one of Trump supporters took a video of a Black man who was working on a machine that literally, it's a machine that just opens the envelopes to count the votes. And the machine jams, and then Trump supporter caught this on video on his phone. Machine jams, the man goes to the machine, he pulls out the jammed envelope, he rips open the envelope. And then all you know from the video is that he crumples up something inside of the envelope and throws it on the floor. And then he flicks off the thing on the floor. So that video within an hour was posted on Twitter. Within 5 hours, that video had 12 million views. And the narrative that was tweeted along with that video was, look at these Biden supporters ripping up Trump votes. This is happening all over the country. Well, here's the actual story of what happened. Poll worker, the machine jams, he opens up the envelope. What he finds is that someone had put the instructions back in the envelope along with the ballot. While he was pulling the envelope out of the machine, it cut his finger badly enough that he had to go get stitches. When he pulled the thing out of the envelope, what he pulled out was the instructions, because that you're not supposed to include the instructions, and that's what jammed the machine. The instructions were in there. So what he did was he threw the instructions on the floor. He then put the envelope with the ballot into the box appropriately, but he was mad, and then he walked away. That's the truth of what happened. The lie, which got 12 million views in 5 hours, was the thing that became the narrative and supported this notion that the election was being stolen in the swing states by Biden supporters. So becoming a poll worker, providing kind of counter evidence, counter narratives, truthful narratives to what's actually going on is really important. And then finally, no one who believes that we should have decertified the election and is spreading lies about the election should become Secretary of State. That sounds like something that shouldn't even have to be said, but it's just where we are. And then finally, let's talk quickly about disinformation, the fourth threat to our democracy. I don't know how we can have a functional republic if we can't agree on the facts and if we can't share a common story. But that's absolutely where we are today. So when Don talked about Kellyanne Conway and her notion of alternative facts, that's the world that we live in. Sometimes it's intentional disinformation, sometimes it's less intentional. But no matter what, regardless, we're living in a world full with disinformation, and also living in a world in which we live in separate fishbowls. That wasn't the case when I was growing up. In our household, we had the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. My dad worked at that paper. We watched the nightly news. And I think at the time we all very much trusted these three men on the upper left who were the news anchors. And then we took two magazines at the house. We took both Time and we took Newsweek. And then KMOX radio was on in the background almost all the time. And KMOX was a talk radio, kind of news talk radio station, but they were right down the middle because they had a huge reach and they wanted to maximize their audience. So they weren't going to lean too far to the left or too far to the right because they wanted to attract everyone. That was the media diet in the 80s and 90s for most of the households in America. It was something like this: your local newspaper, maybe a news magazine, some local talk radio, and then the big three news anchors. When we had this, we were all having the same conversation as a nation. And that conversation was rooted in facts. People who worked at any one of the organizations that you're looking at right now, if they got it wrong repeatedly, they'd be fired. I say this as a former editor and publisher. You can get it wrong once or twice, and you can get a wrist slap. You get it wrong 3 times or 4 times at a news organization, you're fired. That is still the truth today, whether it's ABC or whether it's New York Times, Time or Newsweek, you're fired. Unfortunately, most people are not consuming this as their media diet anymore. So not only are they not consuming stuff that's been fact-checked, that's been verified, where people are literally going to be fired if they don't get it right, but of course, they also are just, getting all kinds of stuff on Facebook and Twitter and elsewhere. It's just outright lies. So at some point, I think we need to reconsolidate the national conversation around journalism again, and around mainstream media organizations that can help us have those meaningful conversations once more. Because otherwise, this is what the media landscape looks like. It's just a mess, absolute mess of online media outlets, and I don't even include the effects of Twitter and Facebook in here, which is where too many people get their information from. But it's just a disaster. And of course, people self-segregate, so they're either over on the right and they're reading Breitbart and OAN and watching Fox, or they're over on the left watching MSNBC and reading, whatever, the Palmer Report. We can't have a country as long as we can continue to live in two different fishbowls of information. Because of course, when you do, this is what happens to you all day long. You basically just keep hearing over and over again on Twitter and Facebook, you're right, you're right, you're right. Whatever you think is you're right, you're right, you're right. Right? It's just constant. It's what's called confirmation bias. And the algorithms in Facebook and Twitter feed into that confirmation bias. And they constantly are convincing you when you're flipping through those platforms that whatever you think is right because everyone else around you is thinking the same thing, and it just kind of snowballs. So you end up with people who actually can be horribly wrong and horribly misinformed about something, but they have the hubris of believing that they are absolutely 100% right. We can't talk about media and disinformation without talking about the attack that President Trump made on the press throughout his presidency. I don't think I ever thought that I would see a president of the United States declare that the press is the enemy of the people. Just kind of self-explanatory. One of the major effects of all of this is that people are just continuing to lose faith in the mass media. The one that is probably most disturbing, because I've got 3 kids, is the darker green line, in which you look at 26% of 18 to 49-year-olds say that they can trust the media. 38% of people age 50 and over. Just to make the social media point more powerfully for you all, if you look at the red bars up top, these were the top fake news stories by engagement in the 2016 election cycle. So at one point, a fake news site came out with the story that Pope Francis had allegedly endorsed Donald Trump to be president of the United States. Well, as you all probably know, popes don't do that. They don't endorse candidates for president of the United States. But within a handful of days, that story had already had more than almost 1 million engagements on Facebook. The next one down, WikiLeaks confirms Hillary sold weapons to ISIS. 800,000 engagements on Facebook. You can look through the rest of them, but if you look down at the bottom there in the blue, this is the total Facebook engagements within the 2016 cycle for the top 20 election stories. The top one is fake news stories, verifiable fake news stories. They had 8.7 engagements between August of 2016 and election day of 2016. Real news stories about the election had 7.3 million engagements. So in 2016, in the most critical months of 2016, fake news out-circulated real news on Facebook. There are fixes to these problems. We got to teach our kids, most of all, to seek out mainstream news sources. We can certainly have a meaningful conversation about whether or not the New York Times and some other outlets lean too far to the left and just, in the anti-Trump fervor. But listen, I can tell you this, I've got friends who work at the Times and CNN and elsewhere. Again, if they get the story wrong, repeatedly wrong, they're going to get fired. So I think we can all trust the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, places like this. And we should be teaching our kids to seek out mainstream news sources, not, what people call alternative news sources. Because alternative news sources, you don't get fired if you get it wrong. They don't even know if you're getting it wrong, because you're just writing a story, they're posting it, they don't care. If it gets clicks, they don't care. We got to rebuild the business model for journalism in America. It's collapsed. It's part of the reason why there is so much disinformation out there, is because people don't have meaningful local news sources to turn to, especially. I think my mom is on this call, and I know she's working on it down there in Naples to try to increase and improve investigative journalism in Southwest Florida. Media literacy is absolutely worth it. It's it's not easy to teach young people and older people how to look more critically at the information that's before them, but they're very good models for it. And then something that my dad and I are actually working on is this idea of trust ratings on the internet. So most of you are familiar with JD Power, Consumer Reports, places that do trust ratings about products. We've launched a operation called NewsGuard, which does trust ratings for websites, news-related websites, and we rate them based on completely objective journalistic criteria, with a team of journalists who do the ratings, and that's one way of trying to reduce, either not just reduce disinformation, but also show people more about what they're actually looking at. So there are solutions. All these things are kind of, taking place in various ways, but they're not at the scale necessary to address the intensity and severity of the problem. So finally, I'll just end with John Dewey, who basically said what Stein Ringen said at the beginning, which is that democracy has to be born anew with every generation. By the way, John Adams wrote something very similar to Thomas Jefferson late in life. I don't know if you guys know, but they couldn't stand each other earlier in their lives. They were totally different personalities and were fighting all the time. But late in life, after they'd both served as president, they had this wonderful kind of pen pal relationship. And Adams said that the project of democracy would have to be renewed, perhaps by each generation, and perhaps even with bloodshed. John Dewey's a little less on the extreme side of that, but I think he recognized what we all know, which is that this is a project, and that we've got to continue to apply ourselves to the project. So with that, I'll take questions.
I don't even want to start talking after that. That was magnificent. Thank you so much. We've gotten a number of questions have been submitted and numerous comments. I don't know if you're able to see them, but they all say pretty much fantastic presentation. So, we do appreciate that. There's a number of questions came in about regulation of business. And how realistic it is, or what can be done to regulate media, regulate big business, who I guess tend to be large donors, and seem to not want to be regulated. How realistic is that in terms of a goal?
Well, so I think the thing that we should talk about when it comes to regulation is regulation of the social media companies themselves. So, having been a publisher, and anyone who has worked in media could tell you this, there are libel laws. If you print something wrong, you can get successfully sued for doing so. So there's already in place with any media company in America, there are already at least the opportunity to launch a lawsuit to try to get people to do the right things, which is the very thing that helps internally regulate those media companies to make them, try to get things right. The social media companies have zero liability for any of the content on their sites. When the laws for the internet were being created, there was something in section 230 of the first major internet law. So it was on page 400 something. And section 230 said that the social media platforms and the search engines were basically like corkboards. They weren't media companies. They weren't content creators. They were just places where people could put content. And because they were like corkboards, they shouldn't have any liability for anything that's posted on their sites. And so that 230 has given them a liability shield ever since they've been created, which is why, Facebook can look at the data that I showed you, which is that fake news outcirculated real news on Facebook in the 2016 cycle, and they just shrug their shoulder because the section 230 is in place. Doesn't matter to them. No one can sue them for it. So what? Content's just content. So I think that we've got to reach the point, which, by the way, the Europeans have, in many European countries, they recognize that these social media platforms are not just neutral corkboards. We got to reach the point in which they're actually being held responsible for the content that's up on their sites. And that's the very thing that will make them put more filters and systems in place to produce better information.
So there's been a few questions came in about money and money in politics and buying influence. And one question said, are there not honest politicians out there whose ethics are above money, and where are they, and why are we not seeing them every night in the news? And along with that, I mean, I get solicitations every day on email or text into my phone about, please donate for this candidate or that candidate, and it's essential, and send money right now. So I can just imagine what Jeff Bezos gets over his feed if they're asking me this many times in a day or in a week to donate money. And so how do the big spenders, the heavy hitters on both sides, how do they donate money? And I guess that goes into the super PACs, and how do you regulate that?
So, so on the first question, there are, of course, honest members of Congress, really good ones, high integrity ones on both sides of the aisle, but they're nonetheless, they are trapped on the fundraising treadmills. They are stuck on those fundraising treadmills. They've got to raise somewhere between $3 and $15 million just to have a competitive House race. So it stinks. They hate it. The best of them hate it. They can't stand doing it. No one likes to do it. I mean, very few people actually like to sit on the phone and ask people for money all day in a cubicle instead of going and doing the actual work of being a member of Congress. So, but it's the system that we had given them. So unless we reform the system of campaign financing, they're going to be stuck on the treadmill, the best and the worst of them. And the best of them don't, with the lobbyist money that they get, they don't become completely puppets of the lobbyist industry. They take their money, they know that they have to run for re-election, and then they make decisions on regulations based on their conscience and their sense of what's right and wrong. The worst of them take the money and they do what the lobbyists say. And that's what Americans hate about the system, and they suspect that it's going on. On the second question, the big money, yeah, super PACs and 501c4s, those dark money organizations, are the new kind of popular vehicles for mega donors to contribute to on both the left and the right. There isn't much that we can do about super PACs at this point, given the Supreme Court. So super PACs are actually the creation of a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United. And given that decision, unless we can get a new decision through the Supreme Court, then not much can change, because the court will strike down any attempts to regulate super PACs. And so we just have to live with it for now. It's a 6-3 conservative court, and unfortunately, most of the conservatives in this case have bought the line that political money is speech and should have free speech protections. I disagree with them on this. I'm a huge advocate of free speech, having been a former publisher and journalist, but I think that money is property. And that's the way, by the way, that the courts treat it in every other aspect of our lives. They treat money as property, not as speech. That's why if you tried to hand a judge a check for $10,000 when you're sitting before his or her court, they would say that that's a piece of property that you're handing them, and therefore it's bribery, which is why you can't do it. If you try to hand a cop a $100 bill when he pulls you over to give you a speeding ticket, that's seen as property. You're trying to transfer property to that cop. It's bribery, and they will put you in jail for doing it. You hand money to politicians who are supposed to be regulating these industries, and it's seen as an act of free speech. So I think that there's kind of a distorted thinking about this in a way that very few people can even understand or make sense to few Americans. And we got to get back to kind of that common sense thinking around money as property, and money has the potential, when it is transferred from us to our politicians, it has the possibility of being seen as bribery.
I think that most people, when they think about it, think of it as bribery, but that's just the outside looking in kind of view of it. There's a couple people have asked, just as an aside, we are recording this session. People have, said, I want to pass this along to someone else. It will be uploaded. Temple Shalom Naples has a YouTube channel, and it might take several days, but it will be uploaded to the YouTube and go on Temple Shalom Naples, and it'll be uploaded on that site. Along with our previous presentations from earlier this season. One question is there anything the League of Women Voters can do to prevent voter suppression, do you think?
Absolutely, and they are doing it. The great organization, been around for almost 100 years or more. Fantastic organization, and they're working on it. They're working to both oppose voter suppression laws at the state level, and they are also working on preventing the Bannon plan, what we in the democracy field call election subversion. The League of Women Voters is very aware of the possibility of election subversion occurring in 24, and they're working on it. So they're a great group. Strongly recommend you join them.
As we near the end of this presentation, I'd like hopefully to end on a positive and hopeful note, if there is one. So the question is, how realistic is passage of voter rights legislation or Electoral Count Act or efforts, if not in our country, in other democracies around the world, in terms of protecting their system? What do you see out there as, not just that this is on the list to do, but what's realistic to actually get done?
So the Electoral Count Act, I would currently say that we've got an 80% chance of getting that meaningfully amended to create a saner process around the Electoral College in 2024. There are plenty of Republicans that we're working with who get it and who don't want to see another January 6th happen. And so there's very meaningful progress going on right now in the Senate, but it's always worth, and I'm not kidding, the phone calls to the members of Congress count. Emails do not count, because the emails, either they don't get read or they get opened by a 22-year-old staffer or a 20-year-old intern, and then they get dumped away. But phone calls count, because you actually are getting a human being on the phone, you're taking up a human being's time, they count. And so we would love to see Senator Rubio, for instance, get behind the Electoral Count Act reforms. There's no reason why he should oppose them. Senator Collins, Senator Romney, Senator Tillis, who's more conservative than Romney and Collins, they're all engaged on this. And we'd love to see Rubio's engagement and Scott's engagement too. But I would start with Rubio. So that, I think, is very possible. We're working on it. We're on it every day. In terms of other federal voting rights legislation, I'm skeptical between now and August. And as you all probably know, things just shut down after August in DC because it's an election year. So I think there's only so much bandwidth in the Senate to get stuff done on behalf of democracy right now, and ECA is the thing that's getting all the attention. In terms of spoiling the Bannon plan and preventing election subversion, that's going to be up to all of us. And as I said, even if you can give money to groups like mine or the League of Women Voters, because we're working on it, but you also could get directly involved in the poll working and poll watching process. The Bannon plan relies 100% on the creation and distribution of disinformation about what's going on with the vote counting in the swing states. And Florida isn't really a swing state anymore, but it's enough of a swing state that it counts for you all down there. The goal is to create massive doubt about the quality and efficacy of the vote. Out of that, to create chaos and confusion. And then out of that chaos and confusion, to basically lend the decision to the state legislatures. So if you know, if they create enough of a smoke screen that they can say, well, we don't know who won the vote because it's a mess. It's a mess. Look at all this stuff, right? Look at all these people tearing up votes and throwing away votes, and they're cheating and all this kind of stuff. Then the logical conclusion is, okay, state legislature, it's up to you to decide where these electoral votes go. So the more that you all can get involved and basically counterspin the disinformation with truth in real time, the less chance we have of seeing election subversion and a constitutional crisis in 24. So you all have a role to play in it. And then the last thing I'll say on the hopeful note is this. We're having this webinar. There's a temple in Naples, Florida, and you all are taking your time out on a Wednesday after lunch, the sleepy hour, to have a webinar about democracy, right? That's what gives me hope. This is a democracy moment that we're living in. The spotlights are on democracy. We know what authoritarianism looks like. It's on the march, literally, with guns and bombs in Ukraine right now, trying to destroy a democratically elected government. This is our moment. So the other thing that gives me hope, basically, is that I feel as if the spotlights are trained on this question of democracy in a way that they have never been in my lifetime. And with that is going to come a lot of energy. And listen, democracy is a resilient fighter. So I think we end up winning this fight, but it's going to take all of us to win.
Amen. Thank you, Nick Penniman. You are a cornucopia of information, and I'm a better person for having listened to you for the past hour. I really appreciate your coming and joining us. And I've decided that every time Mitch McConnell or Chuck Schumer sends me a solicitation letter, I'm going to send a check to issue one.
Oh, thank you.
Continue work. This is, it's nice to know that you're there working on all of our behalfs. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Tell your friends, tell your family that they can view this program on the Temple Shalom YouTube site. Thank you very much. With that, we'll close our presentation.
Great. Thank you, Don. Thank you all. See ya.